All right, take two on this. My apologies for not being as prepared earlier. As the title says, we are going to dissect what your freedoms really are in Canada, which is very interesting because according to clause number 1, right away, there are limits. That's right. So, who am I? Well, my given name is Lonnie Schwartz. That's what it says up on that piece of lambskin up there, at least what I think is. I haven't touched it in a really long time. I got it framed right away at Bishop's Cross Plaza, or what we used to call Baskin Robbins Plaza back in the day. Not here in Marmora, but in Thornhill, Ontario, where I grew up. Ryerson Polytechnic University in the year 2000, in the high-pitched delivery from the old days of Conan O'Brien in the year 2000. Yes, so a graduate of the once esteemed radio and television arts program, the school now, Metropolitan University of Toronto. Anybody who wants to join, subscribe, comment, you're welcome to. I'd like to keep it on the merit of the discussion. And let's get to it. Your freedom. So let's read it. I don't need the fine print microscope here now, do I? No, it says the guarantee of rights and freedoms. This is your very first clause. The Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms guarantees the rights and freedoms set out in it, subject only to such reasonable limits prescribed by law as can be demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. Now, what does that have to do with the description of John Stuart Mill and his harm principles? You see, that's where Western democracy gets a lot of its foundation from. I say it quite frequently because that's the truth. You might not like the ism attached, but it is a far less popular one than the other. A gentleman by the name of Marx being the author of that. And with Mill and many others and the authors of Utility, speech is not absolute. It may be restricted. And where I'm going with this, to not bury the lead, is that by definition, according to our very own census here in Canada, the Jewish people being an ethno-religion, right? You can be an ethnic Jew and still practice, of all things, Islam. Cat Stevens famously converted. And if I'm not mistaken, Cat was Jewish, religiously at least, when he converted many, many years ago. Tucked away from music for a very long time. So here in Canada, the population of Jews, while large on a world scale, fourth most outside of Israel, right? 335,000. That's the whole country, whether you identify ethnically, like I did on the census, or religiously. So combined, no matter how you spin the dreidel, sorry, we're a minority. And for many years, we have been statistically disproportionately the most hated minority in Canada, according to any record. You can look them up yourself, any statistic kept by our RCMP, kept by any provincial police force, any municipal. Jews are the most targeted religious minority in the country by far, disproportionately. A lot of people like to throw that word around shortly after October 7th, but didn't like to use it for nearly a decade, since the types of records that we're talking about have been kept. And what we're seeing a lot right now are people chanting some real wishes of undue harm. And while the follow through hasn't been as rampant I mean, a very openly Jewish-owned food distributor was firebombed. Interestingly enough, was it, its initials were IDF. The D stands for defense, by the way. Words matter, at least in my world. And I know it's in the morning, and I know this was off the cuff. So if you are joining, have joined, and it's like, oh, where did this come from? Well, I got impatient because, quite frankly, around the water cooler on a Wednesday morning, maybe you're looking for something to talk about at some point. And to understand what your absolute right is, you have to understand you do not have an absolute right of expression here in this country. And I speak to Canada. Now, America's a little different, obviously, but Canada's charter only dates back to 1981. That's when it got royal assent. That's when it was our barometer of the criminal code. Okay, we've got to defer to this document, just like everybody else who has such a document. And knowing what reasonable limits were for a long time was akin to this. And I know this sounds really simple, but it's, oh man, I'm gonna kill you out there, man. I'm gonna go out there in the rink. I'm gonna kill you today. Nobody died. There's no legitimate follow through in the arena of the arena. There, that was intentional. Nobody's out there killing each other legitimately. Like in a fight, they're gonna have beers after. Generally speaking. And I'm not trying to make light. Like, that's what we used to say. Is, well, you can't say that. Did anybody get killed out there? Did somebody go out there with deliberate intent to kill, like with a firearm or a bladed object, something that you know is like, no, I am going to see, I'm packing. This is loaded. Like, no, we're going to go out there. We're going to have a competitive game, and it's going to be a little fierce, and we're not sitting there censoring ourselves. We're going to go out there. We're going to kill those guys today. Everybody got back in the dressing room and had drinks afterwards. Right. So the reasonable assumption there, despite the word kill being in it, am I going to get censored on YouTube for that even? Is obvious. Nobody's going to go and say to a judge, hey, went out in the rink. We heard them say they were going to kill us. Did anybody get killed? Well, no, but they said it. This is going to waste the court's time. No, your rights were not violated. Sorry, hockey team. You cannot proceed with this. No, there's been no violation of your rights here. You have no reasonable assumption that you're going to be harmed by the other team outside of the rules of the game. Right? Again, if I'm going to use the charter, reasonable limits. And that, again, applies to the undue harm principle. And where Jews are saying October 7th happened, and there are people in the streets celebrating that. And that, while we do have tools of Western democracy that seem to want to restrict that action a little bit more, it's rather violent. And the words they've used for many years have been such descriptions of violence that they want to commit against the Jewish people and to eliminate the state of Israel. That's a clearly stated intent with follow through to what is not only a minority in Canada, but a genuine worldwide minority. Like when people say, oh, you're not a minority or this or that, there's only 16 million Jews in the world. So by definition in the world, Jews are a minority. But here in Canada, just within our borders, north of the 49th, we're a minority. There's only 335,000 of us. So when we talk about rights and freedoms of expression and how, oh, it's this absolute, no, minorities need to have a reasonable assumption there's going to be protection. Right? No, nobody out there at any pro-Israel rally, for example, is saying death to Saudi Arabia. Now, I'm not saying that's my opinion. I don't hold that opinion. for the vast majority of people that are at pro-Israel rallies, they are not chanting anything remotely like that. I don't even have a rhyme for it. And on that note, by the way, as an ethnicity in Canada, there are 690,000 Arabs. Religiously, there are over 1.7 million Muslims, right? You got to remember, I always make the distinction between the two. Arabs are a race, Semitic in nature, yes, but not Jewish. So 690,000 Arabs live in Canada. Okay, if you want to obey the laws and customs of Canada, by all means, nobody's arguing. People who practice Islam, hey, you want to practice your religion, you go right ahead in the privacy of your own home, at your religious institutions on the weekends, evenings, whenever your call to faith happens, great. In the public sphere, it's the public sphere. Reasonable limits. Oh, my freedom of what? There are people who might have some differing views. We're in modern times with cell phones and easy ways to communicate that, hey, maybe the whole undue harm thing is a little passe. Again, chanting death to Jews and death to Israel are things that people are actually following through with. And that the protections that we see for other people who are perceived minorities that are more vocally enforced. I mean, you could even take, for example, if I'm not mistaken, a minister in the NDP was just downgraded in her position. I even forget her name because it was easy pickings for the NDP. Oh, she had remarked that Israel was just a desert in 1948 that nobody really did much of anything with. And that Jerusalem was Jerusalem and it was there. But once the mandate was, shall we say, rescinded and given back to the people of Israel, the Jews, we didn't have Jerusalem right away. In 1948, it became property of the Kingdom of Jordan. Sorry, I got to insert that there. It's important because people like to omit these little things. I digress. We are a minority. And people saying we don't have the right to our land, that it should be from the river to the sea. I mean, we've dissected that song. That's been ad nauseum for months now. And it still hasn't been silenced because what it is a call for literal ethnic cleansing and genocide. That there should be no Jews in the land of Israel. And that Israel will all become what they like to call Palestine again, which to me is just absurd. Because for every one of those people that are out there protesting at a hate rally, and we'll get to that, that's colonization. That's colonization of our land again. And the only reason the name Palestine exists in the first place is because of Roman colonization. Right? We talk a lot openly about the Roman Empire. Well, it didn't just stop in Europe. It did extend downward towards the Middle East. And yes, they conquered the land of Israel and renamed all that territory Syria Philistina. Philistina, and I've described this in shorts already, is a derivative of Philistine, a slur, uncultured, savagery. So everybody was dehumanized and delegitimized, Arab and Jew alike. Nobody is arguing the ethnic background of Arab peoples. They are, again, Semitic brethren and sisterin, but we divert a lot. Jews stayed here, Arabs kept moving. So there is some lineage. Jews don't deny that either. But yet, for whatever reason, it's appropriate to deny our ethnicity, our right to our native and ancestral land. We are the first peoples of there. Sorry. I've talked about that in other subjects as well. If we're going to use the same evidence that says reasonable evidence that this item, carbon dated with, like, carbon has no racial bias here, says it's from this year, it's from this level of dirt. We know how old that is. Well, I hate to break it to everybody again, but there's very few things in the land of Israel older than Jews. There just isn't. The only time you can find anything relevant with the beginning of the word Palestine as this supposed great historical nation that's contributed nothing in the annals of history under the guise of such, none, zero, is attributed only to Roman colonization to delegitimize and ethnically cleanse everybody of the area of their identity. Ethnic cleansing, by the way, doesn't mean murder necessarily, right? It just means that you wean out the ideology and ethnicity of others through means that might not necessarily even be murderous. Convert or die. Well, I'd rather not die. But I don't want to give up my Judaism. But the dying part. That's ethnic cleansing. And by the way, and this is an interesting one and somewhat anecdotal, but having grown up in the greater Toronto area and Thornhill, the only time I ever felt like anybody from the more observant sects of Judaism, Orthodox, would solicit would be, do you want to put on tefillin? That's when you see Jewish people putting on a leather strapping with a prayer cube, essentially. I'm sorry if it's a layman's term to apply, but you look at it, and then you also have similar adornment on your head. You're being asked to pray, and that's it. Not to go orthodox, not to say, hey, I mean, it gets a little pushy sometimes, but really the respect is, hey, you chose to put on tefillin. It's a mitzvah, right? It's a good deed. You prayed. I did that before. I don't make a habit of doing it much because I don't really practice the religion very actively. I understand its traditions and values, and that's what's made it important as part of my identity and my ethnicity as a Jewish man, a minority in Canada. And I can say that very clearly. The math is right there, according to my very own census. There's 335,000 Jewish people in all of Canada. By comparison to everyone who is crying out about minority status as a race, there are only 690,000 Arabs. Okay, that's less than First Nations, right? Because if we're going to use who the first are here, that's 1.1 million, right? So if we're going to use a bar in Canada to recognize where our First Nations are, there are 1.1 million people in Canada. Right? So Jews fall very well short of that at 335,000. The Arabic people, the race, fall short of that at 690,000. Here's the rub, though. Again, the religious practice, because in the census, you answer both ethnic and religious backgrounds. Well, there are 1.7 million people who practice Islam in Canada. So from a religious standpoint, they aren't exactly the minority they paint themselves to be. And it just so happens to be a lot of people at these, what I will affectionately call hate rallies, are, I'm just going to close down a couple of tabs actually. I just noticed maybe I'm getting a little slow because a couple of spreadsheets are open, but I've got the charter here. It specifically states the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms guarantees the rights and freedoms set out in it, small print, in it, subject only to such reasonable limits prescribed by law as can be demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. So you have a lot of freedom. A lot of people in this country right now have the freedom to have their personal truths recognized, and we could delve into that if necessary, but I mean, look, if I'm going to even play by their rules because they've entered into the conversation rather vocally and have not backed down, the basic rub there, and they call it hate, is, excuse me, you're a 50-year-old man, or at least biologically, that's what your gonads do. You produce sperm, so you're a man. Sorry, I don't even go chromosome. I go to the gonads. She, if I want to be polite, she is 50 with No signs of any real effort to make the transition dressing with teenage biological girls. Now, your personal truth right there, in many eyes years ago, would be considered undue harm. Now, in this country, it's not. And the prescribed reason for such is that it's undue harm that you're not allowed to swim with teenagers. I'm sorry. I'm going to make this very clear. You don't have any right to participate in a sport. That's not a fundamental right. Okay, that's not something that's reasonable limit protection. Like, no, sorry, you can't make that up. That's unreasonable. In most people's minds, it is unreasonable to say that somebody who was biologically born with a body that produces sperm, who is now of chronological age of 50, saying they identify as a teenager and now competing with and getting dressed with them without having gone through, that's not what we used to consider reasonable. So it would be a reasonable limit to say, no, your rights right there are not being harmed unduly. I'm sorry. You do not have the right to compete with teenage girls. We can create a category for you. We can do that. The reasonable middle, people like myself go, well, then we'll just create an open category, have at it. Nope, we have the right. No, you don't have the right. Done. You do not have the right. There's no fundamental right that's being violated. Your perception of undue harm for years, decades, strange to consider it when I'm going to benchmark it at our Charter of Rights that was enacted and given royal assent in 1981. A reasonable limit at that time would have been no. You're chronologically 50. You are biologically producing sperm, therefore irrefutably a man. Sorry, that's not assigned. That is just what it is. You cannot say you are 13 and you can certainly not compete with these girls. That's undue harm. What you're doing is undue harm. What we're trying to do is, okay, fine, if I'm going to entertain that, you have an open division. No. Well, now who's being unreasonable? Because the pushback from that is relevant to the conversation. Are people who identify in such a manner transitioning, and if they have genuine gender dysmorphia, which is a genuine psychological condition, nobody is really genuinely disputing that either. But are you being hurt violently? Like you can't swim with teenagers. What does that do to you? Are you going to bleed profusely? Are you going to go to our overcrowded emergency room, take up a bed and say, I'm bleeding out. I'm going to die. I'm bleeding internally. Look, no, there's been no undue harm whatsoever. Your life is not in danger. There's no threat to your life. The only threat to your life now is the fact that you're being completely unreasonable to people who say to you, well, I mean, look, all right, fine, we're going to get with the times here, but what's the reasonable limit? But the reasonable limit, specifically to bring it back to our minority population, which is genuinely one in Canada, is seeing the streets in major cities of people chanting death to Jews and death to Israel and committing violent acts. And it's been followed through with genuine harmful intent for undue harm, violence. What we used to say, if you say I'm going to kick your ass, did you? No. It's a figure of speech. But if you routinely kicked my ass, in fact, if you went out deliberately, bought steel-toed boots, kicked me so hard that you shattered my pelvis doing it, I think your intent was more to do some undue harm, not just go out there and compete in a good old game of sports. Again, reasonable limits. That is the very first clause in Canada's Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Right away, it adheres to the core principles of utilitarianism, and one of its core authors being John Stuart Mill, in that your speech is not absolute. Your speech may be restricted so long as it meets a high threshold of what is considered undue harm. So let's compare. Death to Jews. Okay, and October 7th proves that. And there's some real discrimination proven written back in the day, by the way, in Canada. Here's a fun one for you. In Canada, we had our own water fountain next to colored people and dogs. None is too many, which, by the way, I've attributed to wrongly. It is actually William Lyon Mackenzie King. Yeah, during the Holocaust. Hey, no Jews is too many. You go back home now. What home? We don't have one. What, you don't come from Germany? And no. I mean, there's a long history of wanting to commit undue harm to Jews in Canada and pretty much anywhere in the world. And then when we find the tenacity to just say, hey, you know what? If they're not going to let us golf here, we'll just start our own golf club. Why do you have your own golf club? Well, you wouldn't let us join yours. So we put our collective shekels together and started a Jewish members only. I mean, you wanted to segregate us. You told us we weren't welcome. So we wanted to play golf. And there was nothing prohibiting us from buying the land to have our own golf course. Nobody's going to fight for us. Nobody's going to talk about the undue harm and unreasonable racism and prejudice. Okay. What else are you going to do? Oh, we'll hire all the other minorities that you won't either, by the way. Right? Like, and pay them. Oops, inconvenient. Yes, Jews by every measure have been a minority, persecuted openly, with follow through, with very little law enforcement or protections. And now, in the context of our times, it's always with, and let's not forget the Islamophobia. No, sorry, no. There's 1.7 million practicing Muslims in Canada. You're not a minority by comparison. Sorry, that's a religion. You want to play with me? Go ahead, but I've got all the ammo. You've got none. There are 690,000 people who identify as Arab by race. 1.7 million as Muslim. It is a religion. There are Jewish Muslims out there. The most famous convert of all time, Cat Stevens. Come at me, bro. Is that still what the kids say? By the way, speaking of kids, back in the year 2000, I was still a kid, but I did graduate from Ryerson's Polytechnic University Radio and Television Arts program, which is now the Metropolitan University of Toronto. So I do have some degree of credibility hanging on my wall. Whether I'm in the industry or not is irrelevant, I suppose, but I try to come at this fairly well informed because there's only 335,000 Jews in Canada, an ethno-religion. You can be born Jewish and go, you know what, that Jesus guy, he's all right. There's Jews for Jesus out there. There are Jews who convert and go, I'm up for another bath. Sure. But at the end of the day, you're always Jewish. Always. They always find you. Right? It's like some of the hate mongers out there who do the DNA test, and it's like, what? My grandmother's Jewish? Oh, that happened in Hungary. I believe one of the most virulent anti-Semites did a DNA test and found out he was Jewish, went full Orthodox. Like talk about a complete 180 there, huh? Sorry, is that math right? It's not a 360, it's a 180. Yeah, we're a minority, but nobody seems to really care. And when actual violence is committed, vandalism for decades, and it is decades at this point. I've talked about this, and I should have taken to YouTube many years ago to discuss these matters because this is not new. It's not new in Toronto. I've often pointed out to the tradition of Al Quds Day, and it doesn't matter who's been in municipal office or provincial office because there's been problems at both ends. They march through the streets of Toronto, so they've been given a permit on Al Quds Day to celebrate their independence, which has nothing to do with chanting death to Jews and death to Israel, because you obviously have your independence for all these Arab and Muslim majority countries already. Okay, rah rah. I don't know what you got your independence from Jews. We didn't even have anywhere to be. So I fail to understand what you marching through the streets of Toronto, through University Avenue, and then finishing at the Toronto Queen's Park. Well, it's not Toronto, the Toronto Municipal Buildings, sorry, or Nathan Phillips Square. The provincial buildings are Queen's Park. They're both in Toronto. Our provincial capital is Toronto. There, fun geography if you're tuning in from somewhere else. The capital of Ontario is Toronto, and Queen's Park is our parliamentary building at the provincial level. And so there, they wave Israeli flags in effigy and burn it and to trample it and shout death to Jews, death to Israel. Sort of testing the waters for a long time, by the way. Can we get away with this? Will they stop it? Well, this Toronto mayor didn't. That Toronto mayor didn't. And that Toronto mayor didn't. They all said they would, but they didn't. And then can we even get away with saying death to Jews too? Well, I mean, we already get away with death to Israel. So, I mean, death to Jews, sure, why not? They identify as a Jewish state. So, I mean, and for that matter, any Arab majority country, or even not Arab majority, there are Northern African nations that are Arab, not Arab majority at all, but actually just Muslim majority by religion, which then has a heavy hand in governance, whether it's official or not, like Iran, where it is officially a religious theocracy. Back in the early 70s when the Ayatollah took over. So they can have a prime minister all they want, but unless the Ayatollah says so, it don't happen. You having fun yet? You following me along? Are you wanting to comment, ask a question? Maybe I'll learn something new in these conversations. I don't know. But what I can tell you is that the conversation here in Canada is awfully muddled because we think we're America and that we have this absolute freedom of speech, and we don't. We don't. Period. It is irrefutable because the very first clause in our Charter of Rights and Freedoms says so. Sorry, Stone Cold. I will read it again. If somebody's joining live, somebody wants to comment and get a barometer of what's going on. The very first clause, the guarantee of rights and freedoms. The Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms guarantees the rights and freedoms set out in it, subject only to such reasonable limits prescribed by law as can be demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. You're free to have a lot of opinions. You can say a lot of things, but the moral and philosophical underpinnings of our charter and any Western democracy stems from utilitarianism. And I've put it in the description. I genuinely hope it's in the description about the harm principle. And what is undue harm? And you got to protect the minorities. The consensus morality is that murder is wrong. Violence to the person is wrong. Words, if they translate to direct violence, that's what our barometer used to be. I know, big word, but it's appropriate. That's the bar. And the bar used to be set with most people going, look, what you're doing, I might not necessarily agree with morally. But, and because everybody has their own sense of morality. But at the end of the day, we've matured enough, or at one point we did, where you could acknowledge that what they're doing is not causing me or society in general any undue harm. Like, There's no fabric of society that's being ripped to shreds where it kept civility together with one another. Right? We recognize that certain words did not mean anything harmful, that they were actually polite forms of engagement between strangers. That's why we accepted language as it was. That's why we printed dictionaries. That's why we spent so much time in school learning words and grammar, to be literate, to understand one another fundamentally at certain levels, because the printing press was invented, because proliferation of language was more instantaneous, because now we can do it literally at the push of a button in 5G. And we're going to pretend that we can't do that we can't look at examples of when we genuinely got along, where we had a very realistic view of what would violate clause number 1 of our charter rights, what would really be undue harm. And we have confused that matter so greatly, especially here in Canada, that it is unreasonable at this point. And that is what it states very clearly. And the threshold has to be met. It has to be high. That is why violence, absolute acts of violence and threats of such, are part of our criminal code. And right now in the streets of Toronto, compare the rallies. You want to call them rallies? Okay. Compare a pro-Israel rally and what they are singing. By and large, it's the Israeli national anthem, Hatikva. Often sung in unison. It's in Hebrew, which is the longest continually spoken language in the world today. Latin is dead. Hebrew isn't. Older than Arabic. Older than any other continually spoken language today. Crowds are smaller. The other crowds, what are they chanting? A genocidal and ethnic cleansing verse that we love to hear so much. From the river to the sea means no Jews and no Israel again. And we're sitting there going, look, we haven't committed any offensive wars whatsoever since 1948 or even prior to that, because we weren't there. We have been ethnically cleansed from Israel for millennia at a time. People even try and bring up the trope about Egypt. Yes, the story of Exodus. Sure. Please enlighten me, the Jew, who sat through countless Passover Seders on the story of Exodus, and that how Moses freed us from bondage after centuries as slaves in the land of Egypt, that we were nearly wiped out completely as a religion and race by the Egyptians, who believed in gods who had animal heads. They don't anymore. By and large, it's a Muslim majority nation in Egypt. We are a minority amongst the world because we have been ethnically cleansed and slaughtered everywhere, whether we're in Israel or not. When Israel is colonized, we're expelled. A few people stick around. Yeah, no, I'll be good. I'll be good. Don't kill me. Or we're out. Why are you all over Europe? Well, because we were ethnically cleansed and we were forced out of the land. So we kept migrating north. That's why Jews are displaced, as you like to say, around the world. That's why the diaspora is what it is around the world. Back in the 1930s, when about 6 million of us were wiped out in the greatest industrial genocide of all time. Like, seriously, when you go out of your way to build gas chambers, you're really committed. The origin of the word genocide, as I've brought up in other related videos. Click subscribe, watch the shorts, 1 minute shorts. Sorry. At what point do we meet the barometer of reasonable limits on other speech directing harm at us? Because we are a minority, period. You can't argue it. By census, by Canadian law, people filled this form out and identified legally as they are, so we know what this country is made of. There's roughly 36 million people in Canada. That's our population. 25 million identify as Caucasian, right? So that's the race, that's the makeup, that's the majority of Canada. 690,000 are Arab. That's a race, not a religion. And the grand total of Jews as an ethno-religion, right? So whether they tick the box as an ethnicity or a religion, 335,000. My favorite barometer for minority status in Canada, and I say that not sarcastically, is our First Nations. Because again, if we're going to be acknowledging our history and acknowledging people in our country and acknowledging minority status, you start with First Nations, obviously, because they are first. And they have 1.1 million people across the country. One with a very recent land acknowledgement, that being Nunavut. I've talked about that before. Canada just recently recognized essentially the sovereignty of Nunavut. It is no longer a territory of Canada. It is self-governed by First Nations in Nunavut. Huge. The largest land acknowledgement in Canadian history just happened. Prior to that, I want to say it was near where I live along the St. Lawrence, giving hundreds upon hundreds of hectares of land back to the Mohawk territory. And the St. Lawrence, obviously, being a very important part of Canadian history in terms of being a trade route throughout North America. So who's the minority in Canada? I mean, if we want to play that game, you have nothing to play with. You can comment all day long if you want, but you can look this up, and not just your first source, right? Back in the day, you had to source something legitimate. I'll fact check you. I'll look something up. If you challenge me on something, I'll look it up, and people do that. They try to, and then I look it up and I go, yeah, no, I'm familiar with what you're talking about too. One of the more recent favorites is the Golda Meir acknowledging the name Palestine and the Palestinians. Yes, there was still British mandated Palestine, which was resurrected, geographically speaking, through one of the other spreads of Islam through the Ottoman Empire, and renaming the land and keeping the name essentially as Syria Philistina, or Palestine, if you will. It's not a name that I am fond of or ever will be. It is a remnant of Roman colonization, and you cannot refute that. Sorry, because there is nothing that exists with that kind of name before the 2nd century BC. None. Or AD, sorry. My apologies. You caught me. I caught me, thankfully. So if you can find it, if there's any carbon dated, physically relevant historical documents or artifacts that anybody in the world has tried to find and hasn't, and there's been ample amount of time to do so, there's none. It didn't exist. The only reason it exists as any identity whatsoever, geographically or as a name, is because of the Romans. That's it. And they borrowed the term from the Greeks, and it originates with Philistine. Look up the dictionary, have a nice read, and say, wow, I don't want to be called that after all. But people still proliferate that nonsense. I won't. It's historically inaccurate in a sense, and it's a slur. I mean, if you want me to call you that and continue to, I might indulge, but I try not to throw around slurs. But of course, it doesn't stop people from throwing slurs around or talking about the Jewish people in Israel with intent to commit violence. Do we have laws that should be protecting us? Absolutely. And they don't need to be against anti-Semitism or against Islam. Give those a rest even. It's hate speech, period. And if you follow through with said hate speech, if it violates the harm principle set forth in utilitarianism, you're disqualified from the conversation. You are violating the law. You are violating everybody's chartered rights to protect them from undue harm. That is the reasonable limit it used to be. We used to agree that undue harm was imminent physical danger. If you want to tie it in even more with the convoy and the ruling of the federal court, was any Canadian facing undue harm? That's what the court asked. And most Canadians were like, look, I just want my food. I just want to eat, man. I'm tired of this. I just want to eat. And that the mechanisms of law that were in place were already being used. Municipally, people in Ottawa, store owners, oh, the horns. That's a municipal law in the books. That's a noise complaint, of which the truckers began to comply with. Between 7 in the morning and 11 p.m., like it or not, you can make a whole lot of noise. On the weekends, they give you a little sleep in time and it's 9 a.m. Oh no, noise. Are you going deaf? Well, are you going deaf? Well, no, but well, then what's it doing? Is it preventing you from doing commerce? Did somebody forget to pay by debit, credit, or cash, or whatever you take as payment with the exchange of goods that they still managed to fight through this incredible noise and get into your store? Well, yeah, but no, there's no harm then. Sorry. No complaint. Right? Most people, though, reasonably should be in bed at 11 p.m. There are some nighthawks out there who might want to blast Slayer after 11, but it's like, much as I like Rain and Blood, if I work normalish hours, I'd rather not be hearing that after 11 through very thin walls. I don't have that problem, but other people do. It's a reasonable assumption and a courtesy to most people. That's where noise complaints come in. Here's a fine. You don't go to prison for life because you played Slayer after 11 at a volume of 11. I'm not picking on you, Slayer. You're on that side? Yeah, no, sorry. You're on that side of the CD rack. This only gets to Q. Okay. Well, what about the border crossings? What about yes, the Windsor and Coots borders, there were blockades. Now, while that almost met the threshold of causing a national emergency, because that was literally holding up billions of dollars worth of goods being brought back and forth between the countries and stalling commerce that could have affected all Canadians. And yes, some were armed, but within the existing mechanisms of the law, search warrants were obtained, found the firearms, were able to dissolve those blockades within existing measures of the law. Well, I mean, the only one they really had anything to cling to is gone because provincial measures and other federal measures were already there in the criminal code. So, nope. Nobody was facing imminent undue harm. Not one Canadian was sitting there. In fact, I don't think there were any records of true violence. No store was firebombed. The most I ever heard were store owners saying, well, they were harassed. My customers were harassed. I could argue that if I went downtown Toronto today, that I'd be getting harassed by somebody at Yonge and Dundas Square. Is it uncomfortable that somebody solicits me to join their religion? Yes, but I walk on by without hurt feelings and go, you can recruit whoever you want as long as you don't say, kill all the Jews, please. That's my small request is, hey, you practice whatever faith you want there. But as long as you're not saying death to Jews and death to Israel, we'll be fine. We don't have to be friends. You don't have to break bread with me, but we can walk on by each other without the pretense that, oh, my feelings were hurt. Okay. You do you. Practice what you want to practice. Right? But now it's, oh, there's this, what? I can criticize the religion of Islam. I can. Anybody can. I'm not wishing anybody undue harm. Most of the time, it's asking a question, and it's asking a question about a religion. Again, it's not racist, it's a religion. Why is it said in your hadiths or your holy book to have this prejudice against the Jewish people? And it's generally the same answer as to what the Catholics and Christians had for us, was that you didn't believe in Jesus. No, we didn't believe in the Messiah. We just saw that he was a really good carpenter and was pretty secular, actually. But he's Jewish. Jesus was Jewish. I just jokingly say he's the original secular. Okay. We didn't disown him, but we certainly didn't sit there and go, yeah, he came back from the dead and he's the Savior and prophet and the Son of God. Sorry. That's where we break off. That's where the New Testament is the Holy Bible. And anybody who didn't believe in the Savior and accept Jesus as the Savior was subject to, oh yes, burnings and drownings and the Crusades. And, well, I mean, shared morality was a little slimmer back then and the spread of information dramatically slower. I mean, smoke signals were still a thing on this side of the Bering Strait after all that time. And not exactly sure. Passenger pigeon. I'm a little ignorant there during the Crusades. How was information conveyed quickly? Well, it wasn't the internet, that's for sure, and there were no cell phones, so the shared morality thing was a little slower. What's that? We shouldn't be burning people. They all die? Well, it's not a really good test then now, is it? Nope. Like, I use that as the example because people go, yeah, remember what the Catholics and Christians did? Yeah, there was no internet then. And even then, it's a little suspect going, hey, it really hurts when there's flames touching my skin. And I know I did not practice the witchcraft. I was praying to the Lord Jesus and my hand slipped. I was still burned. So the shared morality was fire, hot, burn. I know I'm being simplistic, but it's not like at the time people weren't simple. They were pretty simple back then. Morality takes a little while, especially when messaging is slow. And if I'm not mistaken, was the printing press around then? Just 1 second. There's a lot of coffee left. I can take a small break. I'm taking a coffee break. So if you're still there, I will be literally right back. If you're joining, hit subscribe, throw on some music, or just here, I'll give you an earworm. Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby and get ourselves some coffee. Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the... It's off key. If you don't like my singing, that's not what you tuned in for. Let's all go to the lobby and pour ourselves some more coffee. All right, now that singing is done and over with, back to your regularly scheduled information session. What would you call these things? I mean, I know I've got it titled on playlists as we're going live, but I mean, I'm trying to come at this as objectively and digestible as possible. Right? The core tenets of Judaism is to ask questions, but journalism, right? Core part of that degree that hangs in front of me is about objectivity, right? Even far back as grade 10, I understood that every publication and medium providing the message has its bias, right? The medium is the message, is Canadian culture. That's Marshall McLuhan right there. And in understanding that if you look at a certain broadcaster, you know you're going to get it through a certain lens. But if you look at the same story through two broadcasters, you generally find a consistent theme that runs down the middle. So it's usually the language, that's used that creates the story that they want to share. Now, again, over time, that's changed a lot. There was a certain level of objective truth and fact finding that journalism used to encourage. Now it's, were we first? Yeah. Is it right? Well, we got to be first. Again, we talk about Twitter, that little cesspool of a town square is what was ultimately the downfall of the spread of accurate information, because everybody just wanted to be first. So I can accurately point out a point in history, and that's Twitter. You don't want to acknowledge that? Well, I'm sorry. You are, to quote the late John McLaughlin, wrong. Pack your cannon. Sorry. Little homage to Dana Carvey and the McLaughlin Group on Saturday Night Live. You'll find a whole bunch of pop culture, hopefully, littered throughout these broadcasts where I go live, or I don't know, there's podcasts too. I'm a bit of a Luddite and late to the game, regrettably, but here I am trying to provide at least some insight onto how Canada functions and some misconceptions about Canada, and most specifically right now, where we have this preoccupation with freedom of speech and freedom of expression, which we do not have. We haven't since 1981. That's when our charter was given royal assent, and that's where it very clearly reads. Again, I got to remind people, because you might be joining live, you might have already heard, I don't care. Right? The Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms guarantees the rights and freedoms set out in it, subject only to such reasonable limits prescribed by law as can be demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. And if you want to take any contemporaneous issue and add a comment to it, go right ahead. Because the perception of undue harm, which is what we were being warned about years ago by a certain Canadian professor, in a sense, that has since, I want to say, developed too much of a cult of personality for me to be as on board. But the core messaging from Dr. Peterson was, it starts with this. And again, human feelings are valid, and there is truth to, and it's not gaslighting to say that you've got to be responsible for your own feelings. Like, look, it's not to say that the old adage of sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me. Constant emotional abuse by friends, family, loved ones is shown to cause, yes, demonstrative mental health problems for people. It is bullying without throwing a punch. We acknowledge this. We see this. We understand this. This is, again, a reasonable understanding of progression and going, okay, if I consistently say that XYZ is a useless human being capable of accomplishing nothing in life, and that later on in life, that's how they genuinely view and see themselves and literally have accomplished nothing in life. Well, yeah, it's reasonable to say that there was a sustained period of emotional abuse at every level that went unchecked, and that's what that person became. It manifested itself in a way that we see X happen consistently. Like, we've had times where objectively we'd look at human behavior and the causes of such and not look at it through the lens of color or anything other than what could have contributed to it. In our current conversations, that narrative is completely flipped. And people here saying that freedoms are absolute are not. Canada does not have absolute freedom of speech. Again, very tied to the John Stuart Mill of thought on restricted speech. Yes, if your speech promotes undue harm onto others, that speech may be restricted. In our general understanding, which is what I always bring the conversation back to, the Crusades happened. They don't need to happen again. We know what undue harm is. You don't test for witchcraft. In fact, if you want to practice witchcraft, go right ahead. I dated somebody at one time who identified as a witch. Didn't care. Oh, well, I mean, clearly I'm not with them now, but it's witchcraft. I guess the spell was broken. Why do I do that? Why am I doing that? For some levity. That's why. It's not that these conversations are always easy, but they're often presented as harder than they need to be. Right? There's got to be some degree of accountability for your own feelings, right? Like when someone says, I'm going to kick your ass, but never do, and it's usually between friends, well, all right. No undue harm, nothing happened, no harm, no foul. Great. All right. You said you're going to kick my ass. All right. Well, I'll kick your ass later. Nobody's running off to the Ontario Provincial Police because a couple of people who are clearly being friendly and saying, I'm going to kick your ass. And even if there was a slight ass kicking, they both walked back over to where they came from and, oh, yeah, kept having beers together. Whatever. That was the example that I knew from high school in explaining our charter rights. There's no reasonable assumption of undue harm if someone says, I'm going to kick your ass. Now, if they say, I've got a pair of steel toes on, and if you say one more word, you're going to taste them, and then they start doing it, well, then that proceeds to the criminal code offense of, I believe it's assault. The reasonable assumption of harm was followed through upon, and, oh, yes, charges were pressed. Is it making sense to you now? I mean, it used to make sense. It doesn't make sense anymore because people digest our laws through an American lens, and their laws are different. Their government's different. Talked about that before, too. But in terms of your right to these freedoms you perceive that you have, you don't. And minority rights, if you care about them, by every measure, Jews are a minority. Well, you're Caucasian. Nope. Not according to the census, where you can tick it off as an ethnicity and as a religion. It is identified in the census as an ethno-religion. So combined, submitted by Jews in Canada, we have stated ourselves as either both an ethnicity and religion, or even just a religion, because there are people who practice Judaism that weren't born Jewish. They've converted. Sammy Davis Jr. Hey, one of our favorites. Come on. I've got it. I'm not even going to try. That voice is just angelic. And I don't see many comments or many questions. I do see somebody who's been tuning in for quite some time. So if there is a comment or question, go right ahead and contribute. I mean, you're always welcome to. Anybody at any time, really. I'll try and get back to a question or a comment so long as YouTube hasn't restricted it. I go by YouTube's restriction and I look at it and I go, okay, whatever. And sometimes people bury themselves and stay off topic. And so I choose not to put it up there because I'm just trying to stay on topic. Not really censoring. I'm just trying to make you look less like an idiot. I've had comments suspended by YouTube. I don't blame the poster or commenter. Sometimes YouTube doesn't like what I have to say. Sometimes you may not like what I have to say. But here's the rub. Sometimes I don't even like what I have to say. But according to that degree in front of me, that's my job, in a sense. If I'm going to take to a camera, the objective is to deliver a truthful message. And while I do use pop culture, I do try and lighten the mood. And yes, I have certain biases, but we all generally do, and we formulate them. And usually it's been based on sufficient evidence. What's confusing about a lot of the conversation these days is that evidence is really loose and it can be boiled down to even one person. And that's where, again, the objectivity of saying you're responsible for your own feelings comes into play. And I alluded to this earlier, so I'm not going to stray away from it because it's still relatively topical. A 50-year-old biological man is now competing in swimming and changing with biological girls, teenage girls. And the perception, and we double down on this in Canada. Canada is really firm on this one. So, nope. Well, first of all, no, chronologically, you are 50. I don't give a shit what you say. Pardon my English, but I really don't care. You're 50. Don't care what you say. Well, that hurts my feelings. Well, you're not going to die because I deny that you're 13 years old. You're not a teenager. That to start with. If your feelings are hurt by that, that's one thing. I'm not wishing you undue harm by denying that you're 13. You're 50. And you've made no effort whatsoever to demonstrate that you are one of the very rare people in this world that experience gender dysmorphia. People who have genuine gender dysmorphia transition with success and commit to that, understanding every shortcoming of it. And there are many. I often recite the Swedish studies that date back to 1972, where they've studied gender dysmorphia, ensuring that anybody participating in the study experiences puberty like every species on Earth does, and that's every species, in order to at least have a fully actualized body to survive. You need that. Puberty is a survival mechanism for every animal and species on the planet. So if that hurt your feelings, well, I'm sorry. You're part of the evolutionary process. Too bad. You have no say in that matter. I had no say in that my body was born to produce sperm. I have gonads. It's irrefutable. It's not assigned. It's no matter what we say or do, even if it is the rare case of intersex, there's a predominant producer. You will either have gonads or gametes predominantly, and then you will take the predominant feature and then, as if you are going to use it, assign it essentially. Yes, you'll concede that word a little because really you're not that. You might have signs, but we can fix that essentially. Yes, we play a little bit of God, but it's for the right reason there. You're going to produce eggs. So we're really going to lean towards female anatomy here. That's what it is. You don't have to like that. And you don't have to like that we carbon date you at 50. You're 50. And getting back to the study, that there's acknowledgement that any procedure is irreversible, that you will be, if you convert, sterile. You will not be able to engage in male sexual activity. You will not gain an erection. Sorry if I'm getting into the science of things, but these are demonstrative and provable facts about gender dysmorphia and actual transitioning. It is such a finite and small percentage that genuinely experience this. And then people default to, well, the undue harm placed upon a what? A child who experiences puberty and then fully realizes their sexuality by going through it and saying, you know what? I like boys. Okay, then like boys. I like girls. Okay, you like girls. You're a girl and you like a girl? Okay, you're a lesbian. Carry on. Go date a girl. Bring her to prom. Have a great day. How about you? I like dudes. And you're a dude. Okay, well, same thing. Go to prom. Right? Like, there is science. You might not like the result. Generally speaking, I always defer to Sweden because one, their population size is a really good barometer. And two, they're fairly objective. Their branch of science and government are separate. They're not together. Like, the government is the government, science is science. They respect the differentiation. And they have noted since 1972 how rare this is. Right? It's very rare. The people who genuinely go through it, yes, they get what is needed to have that wholeness mentally and physically. Where's the undue harm from that person? I'm not afraid of that person. Never have been, never will be. right? Like, take an office setting back in the late 80s, 90s, when we had a relative grasp on this content of character and barometer of undue harm. You show up at the office the next day as somebody clearly who is presented as, and again, we have stereotypes if you want, but hey, if you're wearing a women's power suit the next day and your hair is longer and you've had an obvious breast enhancement and you've gone through the whole 9 yards, it's like, okay, well, what's your name? Right? Your given name. I've talked about this before in other mediums. What's your given name? Okay, well, then that's what I'm calling you for the next 8 hours. We don't have to have lunch together. We probably will, though, because we had lunch together when you presented as the other sex. So we'll still have lunch together? Yeah? Okay. Maybe you can inform me about this procedure. I'm kind of interested. That's really fascinating. Where's the fear in that? Because that would be a genuine curiosity. I've never met somebody who's genuinely, or at least spent enough time with somebody who's genuinely transitioned, and I'd like to know what that procedure's like. There's nothing wrong with that. Am I going to transition? No. Do I feel threatened? No. We're going to spend roughly 8 hours a day together. I'd like to get along with that person, at least on a civil level. And that, again, comes back to language. That's why we have Mr., Mrs., Miss. That's fairly universal, so that in an office environment with professionalism in mind, that there's not a lot to choose from, and not everybody's going to get offended. It's going to be, here, look, these are hierarchical terms with no bigotry in its origin, and that's it. Well, it hurts my feelings now. Well, that's because you didn't take the time to understand the origin of the word. And while that might have hurt your feelings, and you've made no effort to concede how or why that's hurt your feelings, though, other than this absurd construct that we've come to, that these three words have all of a sudden become akin to, if you're going to apply one to me, a K word. Never in my life have I been called Mr. Schwartz and I've gone, whoa. The joke I go with is, it's flattering that you call me Mr. Schwartz, but that's who my father was. I wasn't hurt, wasn't offended. There was a laugh. We moved on. Or it's, you can call me Lonnie. That's my given name. That's on my birth certificate. I can change that if I want to. The reason that people seem to consistently ignore why there is a sex assigned to your driver's license is because if for whatever reason you get into a car wreck and you are, shall we say, incapacitated, they can quickly look and go, okay, we've got to treat this person as this. They have gametes. So with those ovaries means a DNA and hormonal and body structure that we've got to recognize and treat accordingly. Sorry, we're going to have to apply anesthesia or medication a little differently because their DNA structure will only accept it in a certain way. Or if I'm going to use a fun pop culture reference that's lasted the test of time, Secret is pH balanced for a woman, legitimately. Most women have a different pH balance in their skin. So it is really developed chemically to be more suitable for a woman than a man. Might smell good, but if more men are breaking out in rashes by using Secret, it's like, she won't notice. This stuff smells great. And I'm always getting a rash. That's kind of why. Did you know that? Probably not, because you didn't spend enough time in science class in high school. That's one of the things I actually retained because it didn't involve math. Thought that was pretty cool. Oh, that's rare. Who's this? I don't often get those. And if it's somebody who's watching this, yeah, people curious when I'm not on social media. It's always interesting. I used to be active on Facebook quite a bit and Instagram, but it's just not a healthy place. This, at least, I mean, look, I welcome conversation. There's no comments, whatever. You don't have to. Or if I've hit a point and you went, oh, he hit it. Great. Mission accomplished. I'm trying to present as many contextualized, appropriately facts as possible. What are the origins of these words? Well, then why is your feeling hurt over this word? Well, that's my feelings. Well, the general public are not. And you feeling as though you've been caused undue harm and feeling legitimate violence by a word that universally has generally up until now for centuries been accepted as a just inoffensive form of respect is, well, your problem. You're not getting fired over it. Your means of procuring employment not affected. You're not being denied your right to vote or marry, real fundamental freedoms that are universal in a functional democracy. By the way, footnote for anybody watching in the United States, we have to present voter ID. It's called a driver's license or a passport. Yeah, you got to prove who you are to vote. Wow, crazy. I've never once felt that my rights were violated by going, so can you prove you're Mr. Schwartz? There you go. Oh no, the violence I'm feeling right now. My rights are being violated. Oh no, you want to make sure it's me exercising my unique, singular democratic right to express my opinion about the government with this singular vote. Yes, I'd like to obey the voting laws, which seem rather reasonable. Don't want anybody pretending to be me and voting for something I don't really agree with. So here's my ID. Such an infringement on my rights. The undue harm I felt by passing along government issued identification. Yeah, that's one that confuses at least this Canadian. And I'm trying to contextualize certain things within Canada. I mean, I've drawn some geopolitical matters into the conversation because it pertains to me. It pertains to Jews in Canada. We're a minority. And what we're seeing a lot is follow through on undue harm on a global scale, the encouragement of it openly in our streets all across Canada. Every major city has virtually had one of these hate rallies. And there seems to be gatherings weekly. And there are acts of violence. Right? It's not just people honking horns. It's actual physical intimidation of people to not shop. Now, some people might have said that happened in Ottawa, but it was like, no, they were just protesting outside the store, not saying don't shop here. Part of the ideal behind the convoy, by the way, if you weren't paying attention, is that everybody should have been able to shop. Yeah. I looked at it from a different lens, naturally. The law. They had a right to protest. That is protected on the charter. I believe it was clause number 4. Mobility rights. Hey, there it is. I'm not going to read that one because it's longer, it's fine print, and this is more about clause number 1, the almighty free will escape clause of our rights and freedoms here in Canada. We do not have absolute freedom of speech, and minorities, like the Jewish population, should be protected because this is outright hate speech. This is perpetuating undue harm. It is encouraging undue harm. Right? October 7th doesn't happen without universal condemnation if people aren't okay with the undue harm committed against Jews on a global scale. Just, it's ridiculous. The absurdity in, what was it, Sydney, Australia, at the Opera House the next day. It was the what was it, Let's Go Brandon moment that people were saying. We've had auditory experts say that it was, where's the Jews? Okay, well, if you heard the words coming out of your own mouth there, and if you are going to disagree with what everybody else heard, even where's the Jews is rather, shall we say, troubling. You're not exactly coming over to light the menorah or have some matzo ball soup. So that's also problematic, officer. Uh, that's literally inviting yourself over to commit acts of undue harm, not just chanting for acts of undue harm. It's getting to the point where gone over just an hour now, and the person who's joined live, thank you. Anybody who clicked like, thank you. Anybody who wants to leave a comment later, go right ahead. There hasn't been any live, but again, these have been experiments, and my timing has either been deliberate or not. I'm trying to, again, find these hot spots of where people tune in, where they're tuning in from, and all that a Luddite has to digest. Excuse me. So, until the next time I feel the need to share anything relevant in regards to, well, media, rights, and maybe occasionally, I don't know, maybe I'll branch off into pop culture, talk about hockey, because I do that too. But right now, I think the messaging of truth and what our rights are in Canada and how grossly misinterpreted they've become, well, necessary to bring up. So if you disagree, fine, disagree on the merit. If you want to find census numbers that refute, I don't think you will, because that's the, again, only legal document in this country up until a few years ago where you were legally allowed to ask somebody's race or ethnicity, same thing, sorry, or religion. My apologies. And you legally have to fill it out. So I default to those a lot, because if I have to fall back on numbers that justify these positions, then I have a very legally binding document that the government procured that is considered accurate. One of the very few things that you can't really argue with, because you filled it out. Nobody forced you to tick off Caucasian. Got sent to you. You were forced to fill it out, but nobody sat over you and said, okay, now make sure that we reach about a 70% threshold of Caucasian people in Canada. No. And by the way, as I've noted before, that's down by 2% from the last census results. So I try to base it on what we used to at least consider objective truths and numbers to support, well, what do you consider a minority? Well, there's 335,000 Jews in Canada as an ethno-religion, right? You either identified as a race or religious practice for Judaism. So that's 335,000 total. There are 690,000 people who identified as Arab, that is a race, and there are 1.7 million people in Canada who practice Islam. And again, my bar is set at First Nations because we view them as the definitive minority status in Canada. However, there are 1.1 million people in Canada who are First Nations. So it's not to say they aren't a minority. However, they do top the 1 million mark. Right? So we afford them a lot of protections, and as we should. We did them wrong. I've talked about that before. Oh, wow. Just as I'm ready to tail off, somebody else joins, which is nice. You're, again, welcome to comment. So if I'm talking about something right now and you want to keep the conversation going, I'm welcome to it. And I always just try to say, stay on point. And what I try to bring up are numbers to substantiate, well, in Canada, what constitutes a minority? Well, by every measure, Jews are a minority. That's both in ethnicity and religion. And every statistical measure that we've ever kept about hate crimes, we're disproportionately hated. We face over 60% of hate crimes, depending on the year. And we are 335,000 people across this country. That's it. So we are a minority, both ethnically and religiously. And while everybody wants to lump in and shout, yes, and while we decry the anti-Semitism, don't forget the Islamophobia, I go, hey, you might want to pump the brakes on that one, because 1.7 million people in this country practice that religion. And the vast majority of people who are chanting in Arabic are at these hate rallies who are saying death to Jews and death to Israel. And it's fair to say that the vast majority of people that we can measure at these particular rallies, which is what I am discussing at hand here, are rights. You have the right to mobilize and protest. But when the speech and predominant speech of this protest is promoting undue harm, you do not have that right. That is very clear in the very first clause of our charter, where the threshold was high, yes, but we had universal understandings through, yes, again, the philosophy of utilitarianism. You might not know that word, but that is the philosophical underpinning of any Western democracy. And that speech in the harm principles of John Stuart Mill very clearly state your speech is restricted. If you promote undue harm, your speech may be restricted. These parades, these pro-Gaza and Hamas rallies are littered with hate speech. From the river to the sea is a demand of ethnic cleansing, and by any means, for that matter, of Jews. And they extend that speech to Jews around the world. And demonstratively speaking, whenever people throughout history have said it, happened on October 7th, it happened throughout Nazi Germany, it happened when the Romans colonized Israel, it happened when the Ottomans came, it happened when anybody came. There was either ethnic cleansing or actual, what we have termed genocide. Genocide only giving birth in, guess what, 1948. I believe I have done a short on the origin of that word. And comparatively speaking, where the vast majority of people who are at pro-Israel rallies are Jewish, what are they singing? What's their predominant message? They're singing the Israeli national anthem, Hatikvah, in Hebrew, which is the longest continually spoken language in the world today, right? More so than Arabic, more so than Greek, more so than any other language. And bring them home, right? Because the hostages are still being held and presumably alive. So contrast the two rallies for yourself. Which one is promoting undue harm? One is literally saying death to Jews, death to Israel, and with a catchy tune to go along with it, from the river to the sea, to the Israeli national anthem, and bring them home. The contrasting branding and messaging alone should tell you undue harm and leave us alone. In fact, our whole moral underpinning actually as Jews is to repair the world. I know that sounds awfully presumptuous, but when people say tikkun olam, by and large, that's Jews, it's to repair the world. So while all this hatred is around us and against us, we're still busy in Israel saying, you know what, maybe this endeavor of curing cancer is something to, well, keep at. Maybe pursuing fairness within the law is a worthy endeavor as a career. Look at the success you often decried. Oh, the Jews, they're successful. Would you rather we aren't? Well, yeah, I mean, because then you'd be drains on society like you were in Germany. Okay, so what would you like for us to be? BZ joining from Israel. Light versus dark, good versus evil. And Israel high. Of course we are, brother. Of course we are. We have a lot of freedom in Canada. A lot. Most Western democracies do. The line used to be very, very clear. But in so many ways, we have allowed that to slide to levels that are just not what we once truly valued as the bar, as the kids like to say. I use a fancier word. Barometer. Wow. That's how I learned syllables. I still do that to this day. Barometer. Four. Did I count that right? It's a big word. Sorry. So the bar. So that's why, even if as an objective observer, let's say I'm not Jewish, and you gave me the terms and conditions for what qualifies as minorities and what hate and violence is, I'm looking at this and going, I'm having a really hard time understanding how this group is gaining protection while literally chanting violence, while the other is getting far less, demonstratively, far less protection, while essentially saying, can you please just leave us alone? There's only 16 million left of us in the world. We really just want this little stretch of desert. We are not looking for conquest. We gave up the Sinai Peninsula for peace back in 1967. Like, there's every bit of evidence, right? We've existed here for millennia. Carbon dated evidence that everybody else gets to use. That's us. That's Israel. We are the first nations of this land, period. You want to say it's as the Canaanites. Yes, we've referred to ourselves as such. We recognize that history. That's our land. That's it. That little stretch. We're not going to the northern tip of Africa. In fact, if you look up worldwide conquests, because there's some really interesting maps that you can see over the course of the last several months that have shown worldwide conquests, shall we say. Where have you seen the worldwide conquest of what was known as the land of Israel or any other name that conquered other lands, that spread Judaism? I haven't come across any. Nobody has provided any. But there's ample evidence of conquests and colonization stemming from what is known as Saudi Arabia now and the spread of Islam as a religion. It's documented history. It's what you have to refer to. That's what you're supposed to learn from. Whether you like it or not is irrelevant. Right? If you don't like your history, well, then stop repeating it. You don't have to in 2024. If we're reliving the Crusades through the lens of another religion, you don't have to play catch up. And you can't play victim when you're the second most practiced in the world and you are, well, outnumbering both Jews and First Nations combined even. As a religion, again, I'll default to this, 1.7 million Muslims in Canada. That's more than First Nations and Jews combined. 1.1 First Nations, 1.1 million, and 335,000 Jews. So as ethnicities and differing practices of First Nations observances, I know that there are several differing religious practices, if you will, amongst First Nations, but let's just say Jews identify as an ethno-religion. First Nations have their own practice and are a people. I choose Islam uniquely as a religion because it's not just Arabs, who are 690,000 anyway. That's the race. But yeah. I can see that, yes, we've reached around the hour and a half mark. Probably is a really good time to wrap. If there are points that you caught on to and haven't commented on live, well, that's because, like I said, it's an experiment. There aren't too many people tuning in live at the moment. I'll take that as it is. However, there are people who do choose to tune in later. These do get published. So if you do choose to comment, please refute the point made. If you find a different number in the census, I'm all ears, but the numbers seem pretty easy to look at and understand. And if you appreciate language at its core value, hopefully you understand why we came down to certain words and how in this day and age we can allow for any ideology to proliferate that shows outward hostility and exhibits and practices undue harm onto others. It's unfathomable, yet here we are. So if it gives you pause for thought on how much free speech you genuinely have in this country, you don't. And if what we're seeing today is being permitted on any level that I've brought up in this conversation, well, again, I just default, and I'll read it again. The Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms guarantees the rights and freedoms set out in it, subject only to such reasonable limits prescribed by law as can be demonstratively justified in a free and democratic society. That's from 1981. That is our Charter of Rights and Freedoms in Canada. And as I've tried to lay out through this past hour and a half or so, through the lens of my journalism degree from Ryerson Polytechnic University, well, I hope I've done so to the level that I expect of myself, at least. And that if you, again, want to comment on the matter at hand. Stick to the facts, as people try to cling to still. And until the next time I decide to experiment or put out a short, well, may the Schwartz be with you.